Tranquility du Jour, March 12th, 2018. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 416th edition of Tranquility du Jour, recording today from the Pink Palace in Washington, D.C. And excited to share with you a wonderful interview with Jaimal Yogis, and it's about his latest book, All Our Waves Are Water. So in this week's edition, of course, we chat about his latest book. We talk about neuroscience and how we can speak to our animal brain, benefits of free-associative journaling, and advice for when we stumble. So before we hear from Jaimal, I wanted to mention a few things that are upcoming. One is we have secured Tranquility in Tuscany. So heading to Tuscany next July 13th through the 20th of 2019. So stay tuned for details on that. And then also there are 2 spots left in Penning in Paris. That's happening this July, if you would like to join me for that. And those of you who are looking for something that is online and more like an hour commitment, we have Tranquility du Jour Live, and that's happening end of March, the 25th. That's a free event, and you can sign up for it at KimberlyWilson.com. You'll see links to it, of course, in the show notes also. And then on April 14th, I'm doing a 3-hour online virtual retreat. Yoga, so seated yoga, mindfulness, and then creative play. So this whole idea of how do we kind of reconnect and rebloom and kind of give ourselves a little bit of water, maybe a little bit of fertilizer, a little bit of love as we kind of blossom into this brand new season of spring, which is such a delight. The trees are already starting to bloom here in DC, so we've got some pink blossoms, which makes me incredibly happy. Also, Art and Yoga in West Virginia. That's happening June 1st through the 3rd. And then, of course, we're back to Costa Rica next February for anyone who would like to join for that. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone who came out and supported the Last Pig film screening that we did for Twinkle Space Foundation, Pigs and Pugs Project, our new initiative. And it was such a treat to be with everyone. And I've posted the Q&A on YouTube at the youtube.com/Tranquility du Jour. Then, of course, it's also over there on the blog. And again, a big thank you to those of you who supported it and or supported the Compassion is the New Black Tea, as proceeds will benefit Pigs and Pugs Project. And if you're like, what is Pigs and Pugs Project? It is our organization, and what we do is we give micro grants to pig sanctuaries and pug rescues in need. And the idea, too, is to raise awareness through events such as that film screening of The Last Pig. If you have not seen the film, I highly recommend it. It's stunning. It's only an hour. It's so beautifully done, and it has a very powerful message. And we'll also be doing other events such as June 9th, and I have a link to this in the show notes also, Yoga and the Animals. And that's at an animal sanctuary in Ellicott City. So it'll be my 3rd year doing it there. And it's already half sold out. So if you want to join us, please do. Would love, love, love to have you. Now, without further ado, Jaimal Yogis. All right, so he's a writer, teacher, and outdoorsman. His most recent book, All Our Waves Are Water, is a Harper Collins memoir that the BBC called the best beach read of 2017. He's also the author of Saltwater Buddha, a coming-of-age memoir about running away to Hawaii at 16 and eventually winding up at Columbia Journalism School. It was praised by the Times of London, translated into numerous languages, and turned into a feature documentary film. Right? No big deal. Oh my gosh. So his second book, The Fear Project, is a journalistic and scientific book featured in Oprah, Outside, and Forbes about how we can live more courageously and fully through mindfulness, sports, and relationships. A graduate of Columbia Journalism School, his writing has won several journalism awards and appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, ESPN Magazine, and many others. A frequent speaker, Jaimal has presented at Silicon Valley companies, advertising agencies, and universities. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and their 3 sons. So welcome, Jaimal.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Good to be here.
Delighted to have you, and congratulations on your latest book, All Our Waves Are Water, Stumbling Toward Enlightenment and the Perfect Ride.
Thank you.
You know, I was just recently out in California. I was at Ray's, I always say the name wrong. What is it? Ray's Point?
Point Ray's?
Yes, Point Ray's. Thank you. And they've got this cute little bookstore on the main drag. Have you been?
I have. Yeah, I've done some readings there.
Oh, yeah. They had your book kind of featured on the table. And I was like, oh, my gosh, I have to reach back out to him and get him on the show. So it was this great little reminder of the wonderful work that you're doing. So tell us about your journey and what led you to write this latest book.
Oh, goodness.
I know. It's a big question.
I don't know if we have long enough, but I'll give you the elevator version. So I was sort of born into the meditation cult a little bit. My dad and mom were, in Boston in the 70s, and they, like everybody, dipped into a yoga class or two. And, back then it was more like the first wave of sort of Indian yogis visiting Cambridge and stuff. And they got interested in that and went pretty deep on it. But my dad, for the time, but my dad also was in the military. He joined the Air Force. And so we were stationed on the Azores, Portugal, an Air Force base out there in the middle of the Atlantic. And he had been a surfer growing up too, like one of the early surfers in Jones Beach, who they'd surf in like jeans and wool sweaters. And in the winter, they were crazy. But anyhow, surfing and meditation were sort of part of my upbringing a little bit, although I didn't really do either one. It was just they were around the house. And then we got transferred to an Air Force base in Sacramento, which was a couple hours from the ocean. And at this point, I was only 6, but I'd gotten pretty into like being at the beach every day and body surfing with my dad. And anyway, normal upbringing really in suburban America, just, fireworks and football and keg stands. And but around teenagehood, I started getting into lots of mischief. And I wasn't really the bad kid. I was just like the one who got caught a lot. And so ended up on probation for a DUI. And I just felt like, over dramatic teenager, felt like my life was caving in and everything was going to like go up in flames if I didn't do something drastic. So I ran away from home to Maui, and not really like conscious of why I was doing it. It was pretty impulsive. I knew I wanted to make a change. And so anyway, got to Maui, a couple weeks go by, very stormy. Paradise wasn't paradise when I was alone with no money, but I was learning how to surf. And I also started for the first time, trying to learn how to meditate, because I think I was finally responsible for my own suffering at that point. I couldn't pin it on my parents anymore. And so surfing and meditation kind of grew up together for me from that moment. And, long story short, I came back with my dad and we actually rebonded over the trip, and it was really important. And I tell that story in my first book, but that was sort of my personal life, like how I dealt with the world. Surfing and mindfulness practice, and I lived in a Buddhist monastery, and I did a yoga teacher training, and I went to India in college, and but then I realized I needed a job. And so I found journalism because it was a great way to sort of help me stay on this adventuring path and traveling. And so I went to journalism school in New York and became a writer and did magazine journalism for a long time. But after a while, this other part of me, like I'd say my sort of philosophizing spiritual side of me, wanted to speak out publicly. It was like, I felt a little bit like I was hiding, just doing a sort of he said, she said magazine journalism. So anyway, I wrote that book. I wrote my first book, Saltwater Buddha, which was about running away. And then I just enjoyed doing it, and I loved making the comparison. I think there's a lot of great oceanic metaphors that speak to our emotions and speak to the mind. And so, so here I am now kind of doing a mix of writing, storytelling, and mindfulness teaching, post third book, All Our Waves Are Water.
Oh, so what was your first book then?
So my first book was Saltwater Buddha. My second book is called The Fear Project, and it's actually more on my journalist side. It's a psychological and neuroscientific book where I go and I interview all these different neuroscientists about like what makes us courageous, and it's a mix of mindfulness and sports and relationships. And then All Our Waves Are Water is more of a sequel to Saltwater Buddha. It's more personal stories. So that's the one that just came out.
Right. Yeah. So I knew about those two, but I didn't know about the one in between.
Yeah, that one for people who like science and really want like a hard proof. That one is it overlaps with my other two, but it's I really sort of build a case for each point by speaking to these neuroscientists, psychologists, particle physicists. It's fun.
And so what was your big takeaway from doing kind of all those interviews and kind of pulling this book together? That middle one.
There are a lot of takeaways, but I'd say the three most important were, one, that we have this. So I just gone through a breakup and I was wondering why intellectually I could know that I was going to be fine. And then in my body, it was like freaking out and my heart felt like a black piece of coal. I was like, why is this emotional, intellectual disconnect with fear? And so the basic takeaway was that we have kind of our animal brain, our emotional brain, and it's faster than our intellectual self. So by the time we're saying, hey, I'm going to be fine, our body's already freaking out, and it's very hard to undo it with the intellectual. So you have to find a way to speak to your animal brain, and ways of doing that are exercise, meditation practice, so sort of embodied experiential learning, and also exposure therapy. So exposing yourself to your fears. So you can't just like talk your way out of a fear of public speaking, say, and just make it go away. You have to actually do it, and and it's helpful if you do it in positive baby steps. So, you do something, a Toastmasters class, and you meditate beforehand so your body is ready for that experience and a little bit calmer, and you start making associations. So it's really about how when we're dealing with fear, we have to really give ourselves a physical experience in order to reassociate our brains to embrace things that we're scared of and to grow from those experiences. So there's more than that, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, I love it. Did you work with Rick Hansen at all, or did you interview him?
Rick is a good friend of mine, and he's got a whole chapter of his own where I go out to his house and we talk about basically negativity bias and how our brains, because survival was so important to us evolutionarily, we prioritize threats. And so even when we're safe, our brains are sort of lying to us and thinking like, we've got to focus on the anxiety trigger or the threat. And so that can be good when you're wandering in the Serengeti, but in this world where we're taking in so much news, we have to sort of learn how to focus on the positive in order just to see realistically, because we often don't turbocharge. We have to turbocharge the positive in order to rebalance. So Rick is a mentor of mine, and that's how we met, actually, because I thought I got to go talk with this guy. He's brilliant. And to this day, I sort of go have lunch with him every now and again just to check in and redirect.
Yeah, he is amazing. I heard him speak at a psychotherapy networker conference here in DC a couple years ago. And yeah, I talk about the negativity bias so much with my therapy clients because it's one of those things where it's like, you're just like, why do I focus on this? And it's like, because we're wired that way, but we can carve new neural pathways, and that's always like, it's always helpful to know like, oh, it's not just me, right? And then B, that I can change this, but it's not easy. It's not like, flipping a switch.
Right. Yeah. Those patterns are pretty entrenched. I mean, because they've been going on for, since we were fish. basically saying, watch out for the shark. And, but I think Rick is brilliant in merging mindfulness with the intellectual theory. It's like you can understand negativity bias and not be able to do anything about it, but when you slow down through the process of mindfulness and being able to watch your thoughts, it's like then you begin to have more choice, I think, in redirecting those neural pathways. And but it's really optimistic view, I think, because it's like the more mindfulness you have, the more choice you have, and really the more freedom you have to focus on the positive. And the more you focus on the positive, the more that muscle builds to focus on the positive. And so your life just gets increasingly better. It's like a really optimistic view. And I've certainly experienced that in my own life. And so I'm grateful to Rick for that.
Well, and let's talk about how that ties in with your latest book, Our Waves Are Water, because, this idea of stumbling toward enlightenment and the perfect ride. What I love is that Harper described this as a fusion of barbarian days and the journals of Thomas Merton. Like, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, that might, they have their rhetoric, but I was honored by that comparison. But yeah, this book was really a reaction to my time working on the Fear Project, because I went for such a science-based angle in the Fear Project, which was really fascinating, and I love science. But I also saw a lot of the limitations of science. I mean, science is math, and so to make even a very simple proof of how the arm moves or something, it's like you have to go and you have to do backflips. And so to prove something mathematically, you have to leave out a lot of human experience. And I wanted to be able to speak about poetry and speak about experience beyond what we can just prove mathematically, because now we're in an exciting time where we can wire up Buddhist monks or meditation practitioners and say, oh, look how their brains are changing due to this practice for the better, like reversing social anxiety disorder or what have you, all this great data on mindfulness. But you don't actually know what that doesn't mean anything unless you're experiencing it. And so I wanted to be able to talk about the experience and what I had felt like I'd been doing, really since running away and then living in a Buddhist monastery myself for a year, was trying to integrate these ancient practices into the modern world and understand them, and to be able to give people the full spectrum of what that's like. I wanted to just be able to tell stories. And what I realized looking back at the sort of decade of my life that I wrote about in All Our Waves Are Water is that it was the stumbles, the times where I was flat on my face, heartbroken, felt like a failure because I'd, gone down the wrong career path, been a jerk to a friend, and had to learn the hard way from that. All those times were actually the most valuable because they turned me inside to have to look for strength within, and sort of stop pining for finding my satisfaction on the outside only. But two, that they were a sort of check to redirect me toward aligning with my true values. So that's what the book is about. And that's why I say stumbling toward enlightenment, because I think it's the stumbles that can be our greatest teachers.
And how much distance do you feel like one needs from these great teachers, right? Because, when we're in the middle of it, we're like, this sucks, right? And then, as Pema Chodron always says, right? Like, these are your greatest teachers, like, be grateful for them. And it's like, sometimes you're like, I don't need any more teachers. So what have you found, especially after, writing about this decade? Like, how much perspective were you able to get, A, from taking the step back, but B, actually putting it on paper?
Well, I think putting it on paper has been really helpful. And it's certainly a way. It is a meditation itself, right? A I mean, really all mindfulness is using the mind to reflect on the mind and to observe it. And writing is that way too, but it's in a sense more physical. So I really recommend journaling, in retreats that I've been leading recently. We do a combination of sort of free association journaling, and that's how I write my books too. I'll kind of free associate a story, and then I'll realize, well, this is awful if I presented it to the public, but maybe I can like throw some jokes in here and repackage it so it's entertaining. And I mean, it takes time, right? When you're in the thick again, and that goes back to, I think, the separation between the emotional brain and our conscious sort of prefrontal cortex type thinking, is that when you're in the funk, you just want out of it. But if you write down and bookmark that I went through this is what I learned from it, and look how valuable it was. And oftentimes you can find some gratitude in that. Like, if I hadn't had that happen, I never would have learned X. I never would have met so-and-so who became like a great friend or a great teacher. And you bookmark that in your journal. Then when you're in it again and you feel like, okay, here I am again and I can't wriggle free of this discomfort, you just go back and you say, well, I might not be able to see the lesson now, but there is one that's going to come, and you have faith in that. And then also, I think, though, you become a little better at accepting the discomfort and not fighting against it, because then, like what Pema says, is like, these are your teachers. And then just that shift of mind of like, well, this is a teacher, it becomes, you can welcome it a little bit more. And that won't make the discomfort necessarily go away, but it can keep you from fighting it. So as a surfer, I liken it to when you fall on a wave and you fight against the pressure of the wave, you just run out of air and you come up and you're not ready for the next wave. But if you sort of realize that you're not stronger than the ocean and that this is just a natural cycle and the wave will pass, then you relax and you come back up and you're ready. So I try to get myself to look at my own emotions that way. Like, if I'm scared, if I'm sad, if I'm depressed, and say, okay, here it is. That's a natural human emotion. It's a wave that's passing. I don't need to fight against it. I can be with it and sort of investigate its properties and relax. And that helps it move through more quickly for me.
And, this ties in, I think, beautifully with the Rumi quote that you chose, that you have in the book. We are not a drop in the ocean. We are the ocean in a drop. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I felt like he said it all in that quote.
2 sentences, right?
Yeah. And, I mean, I use this, a lot in guided meditations, where I basically have you visualize sort of being the ocean, like the mind being an ocean, and that because it is really like our consciousness is vast, and it's one of the things that we don't actually understand what consciousness is. It's still one of those things that scientifically we may never be able to describe where it comes from, but whether it's in the body or, beyond the body. But when you get into, mindfulness practice, and you sort of let your thoughts be, or you get into watching your thoughts, like that watcher, whatever that mind is that is able to be aware of the ripples of the mind and the big waves of the mind, it has a sort of an oceanic vast feeling. Maybe what Freud was getting at when he talked about the oceanic feeling. But at any rate, I sort of ask people to become aware of that, like that vast oceanic feeling of mind, and then to visualize their thoughts, like if they have a fear or a worry, as just a ripple even if it's a tsunami fear, it's just a ripple in this vast sea of consciousness. And you can think about that in terms of the brain being trillions of synapses and, more complex than anything in the known universe, or as something more mystical, which, like Rumi, was a great mystic Sufi poet who I think was getting at something else beyond the brain. But however you look at it, it's like we're much more than this one thought, and even though that thought can seize us. And so that visualization I find very helpful, and other people say it is too, just to as a way to remind ourselves how sort of vast we really are. And that's I feel like it's better to almost say less about that quote than more, because it kind of acts as one of those Zen koans. But when I ask people to sort of go out into the vastness of their minds in these guided meditations, and then I say, okay, you're pretending you're the ocean and expanding out in your mind and heart. And then when we open our eyes, we come back into our bodies, but we try to remember that we have that memory of vastness always available to us. And, I think that's true on a scientific level in some way as well, because we are made up mostly of water. We come from the ocean, and we have sort of this memory of being vast as well, evolutionarily.
So what advice would you have to those of us listeners who feel like they are stumbling toward enlightenment right now? Like, what would you say which I think we all are, what would you say is kind of like, from having gone through these experiences and written a book, like any kind of like bullet point takeaways that you're like, this is what I think is helpful?
Yeah, there are so many, but one of the ones I feel like that is really helpful when you're really stumbling, you're in the mid-stumble, is to not beat yourself up. And just remember that you've done the best you can with your knowledge and experiences to date. And you're not perfect, and none of us are. And so, we're all stumbling. We're all stumbling, and those stumbles are opportunities, but there's no need to make the stumble worse by judging yourself about it. You just say, well, here I am. I've become aware of the stumble. And that right there, and that's like planting a seed for your garden. That one seed of awareness is sort of, that's the shifting point. But that first shift of sort of radical acceptance of who you are at this point is really important, because that radical acceptance, it's not a cop-out to say, oh, well, I'm not going to then work to improve myself. It's not apathy. It's just saying, well, I've done the best I can, and here I am, and I'm accepting myself as whole right now, and working from that point, because I think in that radical acceptance, you just open up a lot of space, and you stop wasting energy. You stop spinning your wheels so much.
Yeah, it's such a great reminder. I just did a mindful self-compassion workshop last weekend, right? And both of the teachers were definitely talking about the importance of radical acceptance. And I need to read that book by Tara Brach. Have you read that one?
I've definitely dabbled in her work, and thanks for mentioning her, because that phrase gets thrown around a lot, and I think she's done the most to really flesh it out. Yeah, it's one that is, I think, key for sort of understanding this paradox of accepting yourself completely as you are now, but then also how that shift allows an opening to then, go where you want to go in terms of self-improvement. So they're often seen as sort of contradictory to each other. And I think on the contrary, they're really sort of part of the same thing. It's a little bit like that old wisdom saying, God loves you just the way you are, but too much to let you stay that way. It's like, yeah, you have to accept that love before you can actually, have the freedom to navigate your life the way you want it to go.
Well, it makes me think of that Suzuki quote, right? Like, you're perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement.
Right. Exactly.
So my last question for you is, the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour, right? So it's this idea of how do we find and incorporate tranquility into our day-to-day, our busy, kind of hectic lifestyles. And again, as you mentioned with like the news and what have you, there's a lot kind of going on that's tough. And so how do you, because you're a parent, you're a partner, you're a writer, you've got a lot of things going on, how do you try to infuse tranquility into your everyday?
One thing that I think is really important for busy people who are picking up these ideas of mindfulness and tranquility is to not make mindfulness and tranquility just another thing on your checklist and a chore, because it can quickly become that when it's like you sort of build a whole new cage of things you have to do to feel tranquil and to like control your mind. And as soon as your mind is feeling sort of spastic, you're like, I haven't done my mindfulness practice. And then you beat yourself up, or like, my meditation isn't good today. And that's emphatically not the point. Again, getting back to that acceptance, it's really about allowing yourself to be in the state you are and not trying to change that too much. And so one thing that I do is try to also, combined with, coming back to my sitting practice, is go have fun. Because I think it's really important to actually do fun things that are more sort of like you did when you were a kid. And so for me, that's surfing. Like, I go out, I run across the street, and I just half an hour go play in the waves. And in that moment, it's not so much about like a rigid practice. It's like, I'm just having fun. I'm playing, I'm enjoying. And then I try to bring that kind of presence, which is, it's sort of a mind that doesn't need to try to enjoy the moment. Back to my mindfulness, where I say, okay, I don't need to get anywhere here. I'm just being. So again, there is a discipline aspect, I think, to tranquility, where you have to take on these forms like meditation or yoga or writing, but they can also quickly become just another chore. So to have something to loosen yourself up a little bit, whether that's, going dancing or going surfing or just playing with your kids, I think that's a really important component that we often leave out.
Beautiful. Thank you. The reminder to play.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you for the beautiful books you've put out into the world.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks for this wonderful podcast. I really enjoy it.
Savvy sources. You can find Jaimal on his website, jaimalyogis.com. And that is actually currently under construction, but hopefully will be available soon. And that is JAIMAL yogis.com. And then also, of course, you can find him over on Instagram and on Twitter. And you can also find his books on Amazon. And I have a link to those in the show notes. I also have a link to a couple things that we chatted about in the podcast. One is Tara Brach and her beautiful book, Radical Acceptance. I also have a link to the new Tranquility, Compassion is the New Black Tea. And the pre-order offer for that actually ends on Ides of March 15th. So if you'd like to order the tea at a discounted price and get the cute little pigs and pugs tote, be sure to do so before the 15th. Again, you can find a link to that in the show notes, and it's also over on tranquility.com. You can find me doing my thing over on Instagram and Facebook, Tranquility du Jour, YouTube, and Twitter. And then also the Tranquility Spring Collection has launched, and we have 2 new colors, Emerald and Eclipse. And of course, you can find out all of that over at tranquility.com, along with ways to pick up any of my books that may be of interest to you. I've written 5 since, my goodness, 2006. So we're, year 12 in? Working on a new one. And also, if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, peruse my FAQs. There's a lot of information about how long we've been around. I started blogging in 2004, started podcasting in 2005. And always love connecting with new people and staying in touch with those who have been around and listened since the early days. There's also some Tranquility-filled e-courses. One that is ongoing this whole year of Tranquility. You can drop in at any time. Would love to have you. You can do the annual offering, which gives you all sorts of additional perks and treats, and also gives you access to the archives, which are previously recorded offerings. And then you can also drop in monthly just by topic or kind of whatever fits your schedule. You can find out more about that at kimberlywilson.com/YOT. Also, if you're not on the mailing list, sign up for that. You can do that at kimberlywilson.com/lovenotes. And I try to send something out every other week to every few weeks. And it's usually just updates on what's going on, a little bit of inspiration, maybe a recipe or a playlist. So check that out when you have a moment. And also read about my passion for animals, which is incredibly strong and motivating my future direction. And finally, if you have a moment to pen a review on iTunes about the podcast, would be so, so grateful. And then also, if you have a moment to pen a review of any of my books on Amazon or Goodreads, would also be incredibly grateful. I really appreciate your support, and I appreciate you tuning in and listening. And I hope you too are inspired to find a little bit of tranquility in your everyday. Namaste.